Hi, my name is Eric Fine, and I'm a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine. I work in the west in a city called Ivano-Frankivsk, which you can see out behind me. At least a little bit of it. I work in economic development, and today I'm going to be talking about one of the largest problems that I've seen and researched, and what I'm trying to do to make a bit of a positive impact. So I'm going to be talking about the Ukrainian banking system. But the story that I'm going to be talking about involves one of the largest bank heists in history, the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, and I would argue the entire future of Ukraine. First, I want to talk about why Ukraine is such an important country right now. Ukraine was once ruled by Russia as part of the Soviet Union, but after the Cold War, decades of problems, and 2 revolutions, Ukraine has finally embraced democracy, free market economics, and pro-Western integration. That's really important because a free Ukraine is a huge threat to Russia's authoritarian regime. If a former Soviet state in their sphere of influence can succeed by embracing Europe and Western ideology, it threatens the narrative and argument for authoritarianism that Putin wants Russians to buy into. See, Vladimir Putin still wants to exert Russian influence in Ukraine and still thinks Ukraine should be reabsorbed into Russia. That's what the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine sort of all stems from. In fact, it's kind of a forefront, Ukraine, for the fight for democracy against authoritarianism. That's kind of why we're here, to help make Ukraine an example of prosperity, of democracy, of success, and of course, to beat the Russians.
So we are going to beat the Russians!
Give it up, folks.
So maybe it's not that intense, but at the end of the day, that is kinda why we're here. We believe in democracy and want our democratic allies to be successful. And now, we're gonna begin our story of the banking system with the 2014-2015 Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine. Unprovoked, Vladimir Putin and the Russian army invaded and took Crimea and 2 other states in eastern Ukraine, challenging the sovereignty of Ukraine. The war has claimed more than 13,000 lives and left thousands more wounded, and there's still an active military invasion happening in eastern Ukraine. But it's also important to remember that it's not just a military assault. I had the chance to sit down with former First Lady of Ukraine, Katerina Yushchenko, and that's something that she stresses, that it's a multi-front war. The Russian invasion was also a targeted economic assault and really effectively hurt the Ukrainian economy. In fact, Ukraine's latest official GDP was just 60% of their GDP before the invasion, and their currency is worth 1/3 of its pre-invasion value. So, how did the Russian invasion do that? It's actually not that complicated. The regions that Russia invaded had contributed about 16% of Ukraine's total exports, including a lot of products that went into coal and steel production. When Russia took those regions, in addition to losing 16% of exports, it also meant that other Ukrainian factories had to start importing products they had been buying domestically from these invaded states. So Russia invades and they're able to immediately make exports plummet and imports shoot up all at the same time. That's really important because the exchange rate for a currency is controlled by supply and demand. If your exports go down, that means that people need less of your currency to buy your products, and demand for your currency goes down. At the same time, if your imports go up, you need to sell more of your currency in order to buy foreign products. So supply of your currency goes up. Both of those effects on their own would make price drop, and together they have an even bigger impact. So, because of the Russian invasion, forcing exports to go down and imports to go up, that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. In less than a year, the hryvnia lost 2/3 of its value. So why is that so important? When the currency crashed, it created 2 types of problems. First, ordinary Ukrainians were hurt badly. Prices on imported products skyrocketed, inflation hit 60%, and so the buying power of your savings and salary went way down. And second, it hurt the Ukrainian banking system. Banks with foreign debts saw those debts increase. They now needed more hryvnias to repay the same loan. This new outsized liability on their balance sheets changed their solvency ratios and made Ukrainians worried they would lose their deposits, and that set off a panic. So in order to stabilize the currency and the economy, the National Bank of Ukraine negotiated a $17.5 billion loan package from the IMF. It prevented a total collapse and helped Ukraine to completely reform their banking system and take a more active role in oversight and regulation going forward. Part of the agreement was that the National Bank of Ukraine had to perform stress tests, flush out hidden party lending, and perform asset quality reviews on all their banks. But this new level of scrutiny exposed insolvency from a shocking level of malpractice that had developed in the Ukrainian banking system. Essentially, banks had been allowed to run in good faith with relatively little oversight from the government, and the oligarchs running them stole huge sums of money from depositors, leaving the banks insolvent. In the most egregious example, orchestrated the theft of $5.5 billion from 22 million Ukrainians who had deposits in To comply with the IMF agreement, the National Bank of Ukraine closed every single bank that was insolvent, shutting down 88 of the country's 180 banks. They forced these banks to close because there was no capital to back up the deposits. Unfortunately, that meant that millions of Ukrainians lost their money. Because of these losses and a constant news cycle of bank collapses, Ukrainians lost trust in their banking system. Today, the National Bank of Ukraine estimates that Ukrainians keep most of their wealth, a staggering $120 billion in physical foreign currency. That means just stashed in safes or under mattresses, and that's a huge amount for Ukraine, more than their last official GDP. This loss of trust in banks in Ukraine is a really big problem, because banks actually do play a really important role in a free market economy, and they can't do that without deposits. See, at their best, banks can help businesses grow by efficiently allocating capital to the people and ideas that can use it most effectively. The credit they extend is a critical driver of economic growth. But they need deposits to do that. So how do we repair the system so that it can start working for Ukraine again? Well, the good news is that the Ukrainian banking system has been reformed. The National Bank of Ukraine, with help from the IMF, has new regulatory standards for banks, bringing a new level of transparency and accountability. So I think one of the next steps is to spread financial and economic literacy at the community level. I've started doing this here in my home Ukrainian city, Ivano-Frankivsk, speaking to university and high school students wherever they're willing to listen to me. Ukrainians need to know exactly what was wrong with their banks. They need to understand how a few oligarchs stole their money, and most importantly, they need to know how it was fixed. Armed with this knowledge, Ukrainians will be able to demand that their leaders continue to regulate the banking industry and make it work for the Ukrainian economy. That's how we restore trust in the Ukrainian banking system. And I'm excited to start taking my speaking tour on the road, speaking at sites of other Peace Corps volunteers, at high schools, universities, English speaking clubs. Honestly, anyone that's interested in listening to me, I want to speak to them. So, if you're watching this in Ukraine and you want me to come speak, add me on Facebook, Eric Fine, or email me. Links are down below. I'm going to be vlogging and Instagramming my progress, so like, subscribe, and follow along on here and on Instagram.